While I make every effort to broadcast correct information, I'm also still learning. I will double check all my facts, but realize that healthcare is a constantly changing science and art. One doctor or healthcare provider may have a different way of doing things from another. I welcome any comments, suggestions, or correction of errors. I take no money from supplement or device companies. By listening to this podcast or reading this blog, you agree not to use this podcast or blog as medical advice or to treat any medical condition in either yourself or others, including but not limited to patients that you are treating. Consult your healthcare provider for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to the podcast or the website. Under no circumstances shall any guests or contributors to the podcast or blog or any employees, associates, or affiliates of the Boss Body podcast be responsible for damages arising from use of the podcast or the blog. This blog or podcast should not be used in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing the standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or the blog.
What's up, guys? It's Dr. Tim Jackson with another episode of the Boss Body Podcast. Cold plunging, cryotherapy. It's all the rage. It has been for many, many years now. And admittedly, I've only dabbled in it. So I'm not the go-to cryotherapy or cold plunge expert, but I brought in someone who is, Dr. Tom Seager. Welcome to the show, Dr. Tom. Ph.D.
Thank you for having me here, Tim. Yeah. You might know I'm an engineer. I teach civil engineering at Arizona State University, and it's only been the last 4 or 5 years that I've really turned my research attention to cold water immersion therapy. And what I've discovered about the systemic benefits of getting cold sounds astounding. I'm not sure your audience is going to believe half of it, but we'll get into the details and why the experience that our customers are having and the science that backs it up is credible.
Most of the listeners and viewers are pretty savvy and keep me on my toes in terms of staying on top of new knowledge and information, which is good. I like that. But let's start off so our initial exchange was, okay, I don't understand this whole, meaning me, difference between cryotherapy, cold plunging. Some people are adding ice, some people saying it doesn't matter. Some people saying the duration is more important. What does the science say?
Let's start with cryotherapy, a frigid air versus cold water. The thing about the air is that it comes with a risk of frostbite. Frostbite happens when the water inside the cells freezes, and it doesn't freeze at 32. It's a little lower. It's about 29. So if you go out into the cold air and the air is colder than 29, it can create frostbite in your skin. In a cryotherapy chamber, they might be using air like negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit. They're using liquid nitrogen. They're super cooling this, and you get kind of a shock, but you have to wear mittens. You have to have, ear muffs to protect the vulnerable parts of your skin from frostbite. It can't happen in cold water. So the first thing is that cold water is safer. The reason it can't happen is because water freezes at 32 and your skin freezes at 29. If you're getting into 32-degree water, which is as cold as it can get, it's still not going to cause frostbite. So one of the things I like about cold water immersion therapy is there's the reduced risk of frostbite. There's other aspects. When you get into cryotherapy, it's not grounded. That is, you're standing in sort of a shower stall, and you don't get the benefit of electrical connection to the earth. Now, if you go in the ocean, you're grounded. You go in the stream or the lake, you're grounded. And if you go into the Morozco, you're grounded, because I grounded it. Because we build the Morozco so that there's an electrical connection from the water straight into the earth, and it goes through the ground terminal in your outlet. This is what your body is expecting when you bathe. It doesn't happen in an acrylic tub or in a hot tub or in a fiberglass tub or in an ordinary shower, but it happens when you get into a Morozco because we want you to get the natural benefit. Those are two big differences. And I want to go a little bit deeper. This is an evolutionarily biological story because people ask me about this assertion that I make, that our bodies are adapted to expect cold water immersion. And people say, well, no, I'm from the Caribbean, or I'm from Africa, or my people are from a warm weather climate. How could it possibly be that your claim that I'm evolutionarily adapted to expect cold water immersion makes any sense? But the earliest human Homo sapien fossils, the oldest ones on record, they're found in East Africa. And where does Wim Hof take his trainees? Their climactic, shirtless climb up Mount Kilimanjaro, which is right on the equator. There are 4 active glaciers in East Africa. This is like ice age stuff. And when you go back to the origins of the human species, the bottleneck that the human population experienced that squeezed them between the glaciers of East Africa and the cold water meant that our ancient ancestors had to survive by foraging in the water. It's the shellfish that they gathered that gave them the DHA that would support their brain development. It's the finfish that they were able to capture, or the waterfowl. We are aquatic creatures. It's why our nostrils point down instead of out like other primates. It's why we have subcutaneous fat, and gorillas don't have that. Bonobos don't have that. Chimps don't have that. We have so much in common with the manatee or the dolphin or the whale, anatomically speaking. And it's because we're meant to wade up to our necks in water. And that water at this critical moment in our evolution was cold. Now, there are other times, whether you're the human beings are warm-blooded and they migrate to all different aspects of the globe. And yes, cold air has many of the same benefits as cold water, but we are evolutionarily adapted to expect periodic cold water immersion. And if we don't get it, it's no wonder that our bodies get sick.
And the brown adipose tissue, by the way, that was a very thorough answer, and thank you for that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the brown adipose tissue, it decreases in quantity if we're not exposed to cold, correct?
It is the most remarkable thing. Human babies are born with copious quantities of brown fat. And we kind of have this expression for it, baby fat. Well, they don't have the muscles that would create enough heat to keep them warm. Their muscles are just underdeveloped, but they have all of this brown fat. So if a human baby gets cold, it activates the brown fat. They start the thermogenesis. They start burning up the glucose in the bloodstream, and the white fat cells release lipids in the bloodstream that keeps the baby warm. It's this amazing sort of adaptive response to cold weather. But the remarkable thing is that human babies are born knowing how to swim. They have an instinct for paddling and for kicking. They know how to hold their breath underwater. They're not born, with an instinct to walk or even crawl. It's likely that our ancient grandmothers gave birth in the water, because a water birth is a natural analgesic. It's a way to manage the contractions and the pain. And the human baby is adapted to this water birth. If that water's cold, you better dang believe that the baby has to have the metabolic mechanisms to defend its core temperature, and human babies do. But if you don't get periodic cold exposure, if you don't activate that brown fat, you lose the brown fat over time. Used to be that doctors thought there was no such thing as brown fat in a grown-up human being. And because they couldn't really find it. And they said, well, all adults must lose all their brown fat. But then there's these researchers in Sweden, and they noticed after PET scans for cancer became popular. So the way this works is they put in a radioactive tracer of glucose. The glucose is taken up preferentially by tumor cells. They scan that and they say, that's where the tumor is. So these Swedish researchers noticed that there would be symmetrical spots. And by spots, I just mean signals on the PET scan. cancer is not symmetrical. They say, what are these things? And they would only show up in the cold instrument rooms. Because these scanners use so much power, they'd have to super air condition the rooms to keep the equipment operating. So some of them were cold. The people would go in there and they'd say, well, what are these spots? And these Swedish researchers said, we think that's brown fat. Now, the rest of the world was like, what? Does that make sense? So a bunch of cancer researchers at the Sloan Kettering Center in New York, they went over thousands of PET scans and they said, holy crap, the ones of, a certain person under a certain temperature condition will show up with these symmetrical, it's got to be brown fat. But the thing is that fewer than 5% of their patients had any brown fat at all, because most of the people in an environment like New York just aren't getting enough cold exposure to keep it active. If you reintroduce cold exposure into your life and you do it on a regular basis, it takes about 7 to 10 days for your body to recruit new brown fat. It will correct metabolic disorders, and it works in a complex way. But brown fat is in constant communication with the thyroid. Most people understand that the thyroid is critical for regulating metabolism, but what they don't understand is what regulates the thyroid. It is brown fat. They modulate one another. This constant communication helps keep them sort of balanced. If you are one of those people, if you are the 95% of the population that has lost all of its brown fat by the time you're 45 years old, then your thyroid has nothing to talk to. No wonder it becomes dysregulated, and that could be hyperactive, it could be hypoactive, and no wonder your metabolism gets out of whack. So brown fat does a couple of things for you: regulate your thyroid and improve your insulin sensitivity to prevent type 2 diabetes, to prevent hyperinsulinemia. And once you figure this out, the aversion that people have to the cold, it diminishes somewhat. Like, nobody likes to be cold. Nobody enjoys the cold. But when you remind yourself, okay, this is good for me. I'm shivering and I'm burning up my glucose. I'm improving my insulin sensitivity. I'm helping correct my thyroid. Once you have a reason to get into the cold, Tim, you can do 2 minutes. You can breathe through it. You can make it happen.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's important to take notice of, way back in the day, 30 years ago, they were teaching people that fat was mostly structural in nature. It wasn't really a metabolic organ. But then by the time I went through undergrad, they were like, no, it's a very active metabolic organ. In general, fat releases inflammatory cytokines. Is that true of brown fat as well?
It is. I'm glad you brought it up, because brown fat is not just for cold thermogenesis. That might be its principal function, but it is also a secretory organ, which means it will secrete neurotransmitters. It will secrete hormones into your bloodstream. And in particular, it makes sense, these are protecting your body during cold exposure. There's two in particular. Fibroblast growth factor. So this is an FGF21. And what does it do? Protect the brain during cold exposure. There's also brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is another way that your brown fat will protect your brain when your body is getting cold. And the most important is probably thyroid hormone. Brown fat will produce more thyroid hormone than your thyroid will. So this secretory function within your body makes brown fat a it's an essential organ. It is not some ancillary, well, as long as you don't get cold, you don't need it. It performs these critical functions, but the key is, the reason people miss it is because it takes a long time. It's a gradual decline of brown fat. And then you wind up in your middle age. And then, well, your metabolism isn't quite right. And you start to experience some of the aches and pain. People say, well, you getting older. The heck with that. There's no reason to begin experiencing the chronic illnesses associated with aging in your 50s and in your 60s. You're not old enough for that. You need to create the conditions that your body wants to keep you young. And those conditions is give yourself some cold so you maintain your brown fat.
Absolutely. And so what got you initially interested in the benefits of cold plunging and cold baths?
Tim, I didn't get really serious about it until I got scared as hell. Let me tell you about that. Initially, it was fun. You know, I read a book and the book said, take cold showers, it'll toughen you up or something like this. So I tried the cold showers and I hated them because they make me angry. You know, they're just too activating. But then Jason, my co-founder at Morozco Forge, he said, well, have you ever heard of Wim Hof? I didn't know. Have you ever had an ice bath? I didn't know. So, you know, we bought some ice and we did the whole thing. I'm like, well, this is great. You know, this is meditative and this is fun. We started doing it on the weekends. And in Phoenix, where we live, it gets to be a big pain in the ass. You got to buy like 200 pounds of ice. It lasts about 15 minutes and then you're done. It's expensive. And we said, we're engineers. We ought to be able to figure this out. So we did. We built like our own refrigeration system and we insulated a stock tank, and it was very low tech. But then I got my blood work back. And, you know, I said, I want the whole male health panel. I'm getting serious about my health now. And my PSA came back. This is the prostate specific antigen. And, you know, I'm in my early 50s, and this is one of the things that they say men are supposed to take care of. I hadn't been to the doctor. It came back 7.8, which is elevated. So I had to go online, figure this out. I didn't want to go talk to a urologist or anything. And everything I read scared the hell out of me. I'm like, I'm not saying I had cancer, but in my catastrophic imagination, I thought, what am I going to do if I have cancer? Now,
Right.
everybody in their right mind would say, Tom, go to the urologist, have a prostate exam. But I know what they're going to find. They're going to say, well, you're inflamed and you should probably lose about 25 pounds. And let's get in there and do a biopsy just to be sure. And I didn't want any of that. So instead, I started talking to other guys older than me and guys younger than me. Hey, have you ever, and I'm very shy about this, and guys don't talk anywhere near enough, but have you ever had, your prostate checked? And then these stories would start coming out. They say, well, my doctor said I was inflamed, so we did a biopsy, but then they had to puncture a membrane, and then I got a sepsis infection, and then I was, and Tim, these disaster stories, it just seemed like it was getting worse. I said, I'm not doing that. I am going to go keto and I'm going to double down on the ice baths. That's when I decided I'm doing ice baths every day. And I would get into my forge up to my neck. And I didn't tell anybody, not my daughter, because I thought that they might try and talk me into going to the doctor. And I was too afraid for that. So I said, oh, no, I'm really into it. Ice baths, that's the way to go. I'm at the back of my mind, every time I go in there and I'm talking to my prostate and I'm like, you shrink down, prostate, and I'm having this whole meditative experience. I would come out and frankly, I'd be cold. And so I'd have to warm up. Would do my push-ups. I would get my steel mace and I would, do my 360s. And then I would walk into campus and I would teach. 6 months, maybe a little bit more later, have my blood work done again. My PSA is down to 0.8. Hallelujah. Like I brought the inflammation in my prostate down with this ketogenic diet and this cold exposure. But Tim, something else came back on my blood report and I had like a big red exclamation mark triangle, out of range. You should talk to your doctor immediately. And it was my testosterone. My total T had gone through the roof. It was like 700, which is pretty good for a guy in his 50s. It had gone to 1180. So I take this report and now I'm like, now I can see my urologist because, mission accomplished, right? I'm not in any danger. I'm going to go in there and I'm going to feel confident. And he looked at that report and he said, I just want to do a few more tests. And I wanted to be like, but doc, I'm good, right? There's really nothing to test. And he said, well, I just want to check on a couple things. So he wrote me up, went back to the lab to get something I'd never heard of, luteinizing hormone. Tim, luteinizing hormone has nothing to do with my prostate. Right. He thought that I was juicing because the only thing he looked at on my report was testosterone. Luteinizing hormone is what signals your gonads to produce testosterone. So if your T is way high and your luteinizing hormone is way low, now your doctor is like, Seager, you better get off the juice, you know? Well, luteinizing hormone came back, had one of those red exclamation marks next to it, off the charts, 8.9. It turns out that I was doing the cold and then the exercise, and I gave myself the total testosterone levels of like an oversexed 19-year-old by accident. So I got to go to the library. Like, I'm a research scientist, you know, and I'm typing away on scholar.google.com. 1991, the Japanese did a study on cold and exercise. They put, and it was just cold stimulation. They put these young men, submerged them up to their elbow in cold water, non-dominant hand. And then they did that after the exercise spike. And they found that the cold stim after exercise depressed luteinizing hormone and depressed testosterone. And for some reason that is unfathomable to us, they said, well, let's try it the other way. Let's do the cold stimulation and let's put them on the exercise bike. Just 20 minutes, testosterone through the roof, luteinizing hormone through the roof. The order of things turns out for men, but not for women, to be super important. And so I put up this article and I said, hey, look, guys, you know, we're doing it all wrong. Everything your high school soccer coach taught you about cold exposure for recovery from exercise, you know, it's probably wrong. Do your cold and then do your exercise. Nobody read the article until Joe Rogan got a hold of it. And I remember this day well. It was December 2022, and David Goggins is on the show. And, you know, David's like, hey, you doing anything new? And Joe goes, yeah, you know, I read this article. And then he put my post up and he's like, turns out there's an enormous benefit for doing the cold before your exercise. And this is what Joe does now. He gets up in the morning and in his underwear, and he gets in his Morozko before he works out, and he says it's really miserable and hard, which is true. But I did it because I was so scared. Now I do it because, you know, it's kind of like, it's my thing. Like,
Right.
you stare at that water, and David Goggins said, nothing will make you question everything about your life like cold water does. And there's some days I don't want to do it. And then I take a deep breath and I get in. So this is when I really got serious, is when I had my own health scare. Since then, the miracles that I have been privileged to hear about and write about, whether it's cancer or Hashimoto's or PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, or type 2 diabetes, that when you fix the metabolism, you give your body the energy that it needs to heal everything that is happening in your body. And this is why I post on Twitter, and the medical doctors are telling me this is bull crap and you're all wrong, and they don't believe any of it. And it does sound to be true. But when you do something that is systemically good for your body, it helps everything in your body. There's no such thing as side effects. There are only effects. So some pharmaceutical company wants you to take, you know, Stifacel or Abilify or whatever the hell these things are called. And they say, you know, and they may cause explosive diarrhea and all these other list of, that's because it's bad. But when you exercise, it's good for your mental health. It's good for your cognition. It's good for everything in your body. Your brain wasn't doing the push-ups. How did you get smarter? Because that is a systemic therapy. Cold is like that. It helps everything in your body. And this is why we're so trained by the pharmaceutical industry to believe in these trade-offs and these side effects that people, they don't want to believe that it's true. It helps everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, you know, there are certain single nucleotide polymorphisms where people can't produce as much as we would like for them to. So in patients with brain injuries or strokes, things of that nature, we do supplements like butyrate, which will upregulate brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Exercise does. And then if you combine those two things with like the Morozko, did I pronounce that correctly? Then it's going to
Sure.
be synergistic.
Tim, I don't even know how to pronounce it. It's a Russian word. We
What
all
does it
hate the
mean?
Russians now. Well, moroz is a word that means freeze. And Morozko is like a mythical winter warlock character.
Okay.
You probably remember, those claymation specials at Christmas. Like I used to love them when I was a kid. And there was the one with Chris Kringle and the Burgermeister, Meisterburger. And there was the Winter Warlock. It was this big, scary, magical, wizard. It lived in that's Morozco. The metaphor of Morozco is that the cold has magic powers. It's scary, it's frightening, but when you meet it with grace and stoicism, it confers to you the magic powers of strength and psychological resilience. And so we named the company after this metaphor, and Google hated it. We should have called it besticebathforyou.com, or something that Google would understand. It took us 4 freaking years, and we are now the #1 Google search result for 4 different misspellings of Morozco, which means we kind of own the brand, and it doesn't really matter how you say it. I'm not Russian, and every time I meet someone who is, and they say it rather, oh, Morozco, and I can barely get it right. You say it the way you want, Tim, and it's fine.
Awesome. Well, yeah, and going back to the immune system benefits with natural killer cells, I know there's a lot of talk in terms of cryotherapy raising natural killer cells. I'm guessing that the effect is magnified or multiplied with cold plunging.
You're correct. There's some good research on that, where you do the cold stim, whole body up to the neck, and then you draw a blood sample. You see a big boost in the natural killer cells. So this is a systemic immune system response. It makes some sense. You have stressed the body. And the paradoxical thing is, inflammation is also a systemic immune system response to any sort of stressor. Hans Selye was the expert on this. He coined the term stress to talk about these generalized immune system responses. Okay. Well, how is it that cold water therapy is going to bring your inflammation down? You'd think if inflammation is good for fighting infection and good for fighting stress, not chronic inflammation, but acute inflammation, and you're taking the inflammation down, wouldn't that leave you more vulnerable? But your body has compensatory mechanisms. You take the inflammation down, and your body upregulates these other immune system responses in a way that leaves you more robust instead of less. Now, I'm not a physician. I don't give medical advice. I'm not saying, if you've got a fever or you feel a cold coming on, that you can cure it with cold water therapy. What I am saying is that in a prophylactic way, in a preventative way, you're going to keep your immune system toned by giving it what's called hormetic stress, by giving it a little ping every once in a while. And you could say, the science is there and that's terrific. But there's also the experience. Nothing really matters but your N equals 1. I don't care what the p hack value on your, 0.01. Do you belong to the 99% that responded in this scientific study, or do you belong to the 1% that didn't? And the only way is to test it on yourself. So this is my experience. We just came out of this huge, infectious disease scare with COVID. But Tim, I've been tested 9 times and I can't catch this disease because I teach on campus. They would randomly select us for these saliva tests. I had 2 blood antibody tests. My daughter was infected, and there was a time I was very naive. I thought, well, if I self-infect, I'm going to have the antibodies. I won't have to get the vaccine. So tell me what doorknob I should click. Where do I get this COVID? And I was trying, and Tim, I just couldn't catch it. So then the vaccine mandates came through, and they didn't even respect, natural immunity, and it put me in so now I don't want to catch anything. The point being, my N equals 1, it's working for me. My immune system is robust, and I can't tell you that I'm invincible. Like I wish I could, but that would be, hubris. It would be fallacious. I'm just telling you that I'm not getting sick.
Absolutely. And I know you're a big proponent of using the cold plunges strategically and avoiding, obviously, any contraindications and precautionary principles. Walk us through what some of those would be. So, one of the terms that listeners and viewers are familiar with is allostatic load. So if someone has, a certain amount of mycotoxins and then some mercury and aluminum and then gut dysbiosis, a circadian mismatch, and then you add another stressor, which would typically be beneficial or hormetic, like a sauna or a cold plunge, it could put them over the physiological tipping point. Can you talk to us about that?
There is a fine line between eustress, which is beneficial, and distress, which is harmful. And, as a teacher, as a clinician, you want the eustress for your patients, but you have to calibrate. You have to be very sensitive to when they might tip over into distress. The big one for me, this is coming out of a book that was written by a French gastroenterologist, but he also ran a winter swimming club. So he's in Marseille, he gets into the Mediterranean, and in the winter, it's very cold. And he's saying, these are all the things medically I've observed. The big one for me was hypertension. When you get into the cold, vasoconstriction, changes the circulation of the distribution of blood in your body. It shuts down the circulation in your limbs to defend your core temperature. That vasoconstriction causes the body to accumulate in the core, and of course in anything that isn't cold, which would be up in your head. Now that could be great. Increased perfusion to the brain could be very beneficial, especially if you're dealing with a traumatic brain injury. But it reduces the overall volume available in your limbs to store this blood. Your blood pressure will increase. In most people, that is a hormetic stressor. It's a temporary thing. They get big improvements in their vasculature. They get big improvements in their circulation. But if you already are suffering from hypertension, you got to take it easy with this whole body cold exposure, because it could tip you into this de-stress. There are a few other contraindications. I've got an article on this. And there are some precautionary protocols that, again, you can read in my article online. They're simple.
Okay.
But the other one, probably the second one that comes up that I get a lot of questions on, is Raynaud's. Well, I could never get cold. I suffer from Raynaud's syndrome, and I can sympathize. The number one precautionary principle is there's no coercion. You don't force anybody in. You don't bully them in. They get in of their own accord, because Raynaud's is an overreaction of this vasoconstriction. It's a psychophysiological, there's a complex interaction between the nervous system and the usual physiology that creates an exaggerated response to the cold. And you cannot bully somebody out of their Raynaud's, but you can create an environment in which what's called exposure therapy will extinguish their exaggerated response, the anxiety that comes with Raynaud's.
Kind of like
It can be
systematic
overcome.
desensitization.
It's exactly right. You titrate the cold exposure to the anxiety. You don't start them off at 34 if that's not what you start them off at 60. You start them off with 15 seconds. You gradually build up. I have seen this in 2 women who suffered what's called primary Raynaud's, which means there's no sort of comorbidity or underlying source that would also cause Raynaud's. And they were able, through guidance and this exposure therapy, to get to 4 minutes in 34-degree water. It is astounding, even putting their hands in. And you can imagine the freedom that they feel for not having to be anxious about cold exposure. Whereas their physicians, the typical advice was, oh, you have Raynaud's, you should keep it warm. Keep the thermostat warm, keep yourself bundled up. This traditional advice is temporarily more comfortable, but long-term, it's like a straitjacket to put constraints around these people who suffer Raynaud's. Much better to overcome it and be free to enjoy winter sports, free to go outside, free to make snowballs with your kids, or whatever it is that you weren't able to do before.
Yeah, I mean, one of the medical doctors I trained with, he says that most of the conditions we refer to as autoimmune technically are neuroimmune. There's the neuroendocrine and immune systems are like this triangle, and they're in a constant 3-way phone call, and they're talking to each other. And
Yep.
you got molecular mimicry with the pathogens switching the epitope switching, changing of the proteins on the surface of the cell membranes, but you get the immunomodulatory effects, not necessarily immune boosting, but immune modulating from the cold, correct?
Correct. The amazing thing about autoimmune disorders is that they all seem to have their origins. I'm at the risk of exaggerating. They're all related to vitamin D. My son has type 1 diabetes. He was diagnosed in 2001. There was so much I didn't know. I had to learn about metabolism and insulin just to care for him. And sure enough, a longitudinal study came out of Finland about 3 or 4 years after he was diagnosed. And it said vitamin D deficiency during late stage pregnancy and the first year of life is extraordinarily correlated with risk of type 1 diabetes later on. I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. I wish I had known. I would have done it differently for my wife and my son in his first year. Well, guess what? Multiple sclerosis associated with vitamin D deficiency.
Further away you get from the
Parkinson's.
equator.
Right. And these things, they're complex. When my son was diagnosed, he didn't necessarily have an acute vitamin D problem then. It happened before his immune system had matured, because a baby is not born with all of the facilities, all the mechanisms matured. That immune system needs to be trained, and it needs to continue to develop, just like the brain. Well, it's a vitamin D deficiency at a critical stage of development, not necessarily that coincides with the diagnosis. Rheumatoid arthritis, all of these things that we considered chronic, irreversible conditions turn out to be related to the immune system, and vitamin D is at the core. Now, that's interesting. We know that during the winter, you don't make as much vitamin D. The body has this incredible compensatory mechanism in which cold exposure will help mitigate some of the adverse consequences of a vitamin D insufficiency. Diabetes is a great example. Cold exposure will up your insulin sensitivity. It means that your pancreas, the islet cells in there, don't have to work as hard to produce the insulin to get the same sort of glucose regulation. And we're seeing this in epidemiological study after epidemiological study. Somewhere there is a relationship. You were talking about the triangle between cold, vitamin D, and sunshine in such a way that when your bodies aren't getting enough sunshine, a little bit of cold will help your body compensate until spring. And you should be out, in March and in April and get more of that UVB when the cold is not available. I wish I could decode it. And maybe I'm not that smart, or maybe the science hasn't been done, but I've got a book coming out called Uncommon Cold. And I wrote a chapter on autoimmune disorders. And it took me forever, because the more I went into the literature, the more of these revelations were coming out of the different studies that hadn't been connected to one another. I got to admit, it was because I got a friend with Parkinson's, and he said, "Tom, I don't want to take that L-Dopa. What can I do?" And I said, "Well, you get a huge dopamine hit, endogenous. Your body makes it if you get into the cold." He said, "The cold frightens me." "What's so scary?" He said, "Well, my Parkinson's tremor, is part of what I can't control. I don't want people to see it. And if I begin that tremor, I get very anxious. When I get cold, I'll shiver. And it frightens me because I don't know if it's the shiver or the Parkinson's tremor."
Right.
We started him off at 60 degrees and he shivered. He felt great. The cramping and the pain in his left foot subsided. He felt the shivering, but he didn't experience a Parkinson's tremor. His gait improved. His posture improved. I said, "This is great. Just go down 1 degree Fahrenheit every day, to acclimate yourself to the cold. It's going to take a week or so." He called me up 2 weeks later. He said, "Tom, it's not working." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "The cold acclimation, it's not working. I still get the gasp reflex. I still shiver." I say, "Wow, that's just terrible. I'm so sorry. What temperature are you?" He goes, "Oh, I've been going down 1 degree Fahrenheit every day. Just like you said, I'm at 45 now." I said, "Well, Of course, you're still feeling the shock. Of course, because you keep getting a little colder and a little colder.
Right.
You're still acclimating. Just leave it at 45. He called me up a month later. He said, Tom, this is great. I can't say that I'm reversed, but my wife says my posture is improved. She says that my gait has improved. I have more confidence. I have fewer symptoms. I I feel really optimistic and I want to keep it up. Now, I'm not a medical doctor and there is no cure for Parkinson's, but I know I can reverse type 2 diabetes. I know rheumatoid arthritis is 100% reversible. Type 1 diabetes is not. There's this interesting intersection of autoimmune conditions that we can sort of some of them we can reverse and others we can nibble around the edges, and I wish I could understand it better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the genes getting turned on, certain genes getting turned on, epigenetic switches, things of that nature play a role. I will tell you an N equals one story. Back in 2012, I was practicing in North Carolina, and a mom brought in her son. I think he was 7 or 8, and he had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. We did some very basic blood work, and his vitamin D was low. He had MTHFR and his homocysteine was elevated. So we gave him a cream that had B6, B12, methylfolate, and then some vitamin D. He was able in 6 weeks to cut his dose of insulin in half. And it was super basic, like mind
Yep.
numbingly simple.
I spent 8 years tracking everything that my son ate, all of his exercise, all of his blood sugar reading. I have journals, they're stacked up this high because this was before CGM, this was before smartphones. I would write it all by hand with my number 2 pencil. And then I would meet with the dietitian. And I would say, so, this is what we're up against, and this is his insulin demand, and this is what effect. And they would tell me, no, that's not possible. Protein will not raise your blood sugar. And I said, no, hang on. Have you ever heard of neoglucogenesis? I have data right here that says cheeseburger, no bun, and I'm getting 160 on his blood sugar 3 hours later. And this is why I'm up in his MPH. And they'd say, well, there's so much misinformation. What counts is what's happening to your body. And when you track it, you learn how to improve it. And I don't care what anybody else says. You got to go with what works for you.
Yeah, I couldn't express that anymore in a more articulate manner. When I was in my doctorate program at the Medical University of South Carolina, I heard day in and day out, oh, the best, you can't take anything from a textbook. You can't use clinical reasoning. It's got to be from a randomized controlled trial. Well, there are no randomized controlled trials that I know of on parachutes, but I'm not jumping out of a plane without one. So does that mean they don't work? And let's say you're my patient and you come in, you say, hey, Dr. Tim, this is working great for me. My blood work is improved. My mood is improved. And I'm like, no, I got this paper from PubMed. It says it couldn't possibly work. So you're a liar.
Yep. I sent my luteinizing hormone results back to my urologist. So now he knows I'm totally natural. He emails me back and says, okay. Did he ask me? What do he's about my age. Did he say, well, Seager, what are you doing? It's like, how did you achieve it? What have you changed? Not the least bit curious, because the next guy who comes into his office, maybe low T or something like that, what is my urologist supposed to do? Well, I got this patient and it was really interesting. He told me he was doing he can't prescribe that. So medicine is practiced in a very defensive way. It becomes so conservative. If it's working for you, then they just sort of write you off and let you go. But it doesn't change anything about how they treat other people. The best thing I think now is that patients are getting connected to one another. People are trading knowledge, whether it's in forums on the internet or whether it's in podcasts like this, they're trading experiences rather than randomized controlled trials. And there's such an upsurgence. So many people have come out of the COVID lockdowns and saying, well, I guess I just got to take charge of my own health because I can't trust, the FDA. I can't trust the CDC. I can't even trust what half these doctors say. I just got to figure this out for myself. many of those people are becoming my customers.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the CDC originally, maybe 9 or 10 years ago, they said we don't receive any outside funding. And then 4 or 5 years ago, they said, oh, our bad. We get 46% of our annual operating budget from pharmaceutical companies. So if they're admitting to 46%, my hunch is that it's significantly higher.
Yep.
And
Especially because there's a cushy job waiting for you at a pharmaceutical company as soon as you step down from your government regulatory role. And everybody working in a government regulatory role knows that. It's called the regulatory capture. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize that executive position with the stock options that they're going to get at Pfizer when they're done being a government employee.
yeah,
It's
and I
corrupt.
mean, it's really unfortunate and it is extremely corrupt, but I think patients are becoming more knowledgeable than ever. And I mean, my patients and clients keep me on my toes, but I'm very thankful for that. And, one time, this 8, 9 years ago, someone asked me, hey, do you get offended when I bring you these articles? I'm like, no, there's not enough hours in the day for me to find all this stuff. So you bring all the articles you want, you back your truck up and we'll unload it together, you know? So
Yep.
let's talk about cold shock proteins. I know heat shock proteins are near and dear to my heart. I haven't really had the courage to meet with the cold shock proteins yet.
Have one article on cold shock proteins because there was a team from University of Rochester, and they were intrigued with this paradox. The genetic theory of cancer says that cancer originates in mutations that happen in the DNA inside the nucleus. But the paradox is, how the hell do you have a bowhead whale? Because these bowhead whales are so enormous. They have so many cells and they live for 200 years. And if cancer originates in mutations in the nucleus, then these things should be riddled with cancer by the time they're 75. And they're not. So this team from the University of Rochester said, well, we want to investigate that. What they discovered is a cold shock protein that is responsible for DNA repair. So they hypothesized that the cold exposure, because the bowhead whales, they migrate into the Arctic Ocean, that the cold exposure was expressing within the bowhead whale like higher concentrations of this cold shock protein that would then identify and correct defects in the DNA. Now, I think the paper's fairly credible. And that's one mechanism, but I don't think it's the only one. I think there is also the fact that tumor cells, principally 80% of them rely on glucose. Not all of them, but principally they rely on glucose to proliferate. If you shut down their glucose, you will shut down their growth rate. There's also the fact that ketones are toxic to tumor cells. Ketones will inhibit the growth of tumor cells. So what is cold exposure doing for you? It activates your brown fat, which preferentially clears glucose from your bloodstream so it's no longer available to tumor cells. And it's the fastest way to stimulate production of endogenous ketones. So glucose is going down, ketones are going up, both of which are hostile to tumor cells, and you're making the cold shock protein that can repair defects in DNA. I think there is something to this that this collection of mechanisms that are principally metabolic, but also act at a genetic level within the nucleus. The thing that most people either they don't know or they forget is that mitochondria have their own DNA. And nobody taught me that in high school biology. Nobody taught me that aspect of genetics. They're very difficult to assay. That is, they're hard to characterize. You can do DNA methylation. You can sequence the whole human genome because inside each cell, there is one copy of your human DNA. But there are thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA, and they're all in different states of disrepair. And so when you sample that, you say, well, what the heck is really going on with the mitochondria? It's just more difficult to get a handle on. But when you get cold, It is the most effective way to stimulate what's called mitobiogenesis. So your body will use mitophagy to identify the defective mitochondria,
And
destroy
repair.
them, reabsorb the building blocks. Mitobiogenesis create new mitochondria with better DNA. And this is where I'm going to tie it all back to aging, because cancer and a number of the other things like type 2 diabetes are associated with aging. We call them the chronic illnesses of aging. I think aging is a mitochondrial phenomenon. I haven't gone that far into the cold shock proteins and what happens to the DNA in the nucleus, because I'm so fascinated by what's happening to our mitochondrial DNA and the way that responds to the cold that I've kind of neglected the cold shock bit myself.
Well, you mentioned blood sugar improvements in glucose partitioning or nutrient partitioning and improving insulin sensitivity over time. But when we talk about an acute bout of cold exposure, if I haven't eaten and I just wake up in the morning and I go outside and get in my Morosco, is it going to drop my blood sugar potentially?
First thing that happens when you get in your Morosco is your liver releases glycogen into your bloodstream. This is activated by your central nervous system. The autonomic division of the nervous system says fight or flight. They're like, Tim, what are you doing? We're going to die. You got to get out of here. It's the autonomic nervous system that signals the brown fat, and it also signals the liver to give you a glycogen hit because it thinks your muscles are going to have to run or fight. So you will get, I've got CGM data on this. A healthy person will spike up to about 140 for less than a minute because the brown fat begins clearing that glucose immediately. So your body has mechanisms for regulating your blood sugars. And one of them is glycogen release to boost it up. The other one is this synthesis of glucose from proteins and some fats, this neoglucogenesis in the liver, but that takes more time. And once you get into the cold, you get your glycogen hit. Now it's clearing out the glucose. Your white fat cells will release into your bloodstream lipids because your body knows that glycogen response is finite. You can't store a lot of energy in the form of glucose, and it's switching you over to fat metabolism within minutes. You will begin to produce ketones. Now, if you get out, you might be hungry and you snack up. That ketone release will be temporary. But I tested this for myself. Thanksgiving is coming up. And last Thanksgiving, I tested this. I love pumpkin pie, Tim, and I'm going to eat the whole damn pie. I like it better than the stuffing. I'm going to save room. And so I did because it's Thanksgiving. And then, of course, I felt guilty. So I measured the ketones in my urine, and I had like trace right after I ate that pie. I'm almost always on the edge of ketosis, but the pie is going to knock me out, right? Then I got in my Morosco, stayed in there 4 or 5 minutes, nothing extreme. I got out and I measured myself again a couple hours later, and I'm at small. My ketone levels went up because I had used the ice bath to clear out the glucose spike from my dessert. So are you going to go low if you're already fasting? And I can't say that you will, because your liver's going to take care of you. Neoglucogenesis is going to keep your minimum level, and you're going to switch over to a fat metabolism that produces ketones. Those ketones will cross the blood-brain barrier, and they will fuel the metabolism in your brain preferentially. There are several aspects of your brain that prefer ketones over glucose. So unless you have another sort of underlying medical condition, just being fasted when you do your ice bath is insufficient to put you into a hypoglycemic state. And that is not a promise to anyone and it's not medical, because I don't know, I don't know your chart. And even if I did, I wouldn't be able to read it. I'm telling you about my experiences and generally the way the body modulates blood glucose levels.
Absolutely. And so for someone who's new to cold exposure, do you recommend, like, let's say I've never done it, I'm going to buy Morosco. Can I start right away? Do I need to start with cold showers? How do we titrate the dose?
I hate cold showers. Let me rephrase. for me. Not everybody can afford, $14,000 worth of ice bath equipment. For me, it's a great investment because I use it every day and it saves me from going to the store and buying ice. But I get it. People want to experiment before they make a big investment. So everybody, just like I did, starts with cold. But there's a really good study out of Finland that compared partial cold water immersion to whole body cold water immersion. Partial activates, it elevates your blood, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, it stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, and it never brings you back down. The whole body will give you an initial shock of sympathetic, and then it will improve your vagal tone. It will strengthen your parasympathetic, sort of the rest and digest part, and it will calm you down. I've got really good EEG data on this. What happens to the brain waves? And this is involuntary. These are inexperienced people who have no meditation practice, but they get in, boom, brain goes straight into a meditative state and it stays there. So there's a difference between the cold showers that make me angry and the ice baths that calm me down. That's psychological. Metabolically, cold showers are great. You're going to feel gas reflex. You're going to activate brown fat. You're going to clear glucose from your bloodstream. You're going to improve your insulin sensitivity. But this is one of the things that people are not fully appreciating. I'm going to blame Huberman for this because Huberman will have Susanna Solberg on the show and they will talk about the metabolic aspects, but they will never say, but there's another aspect, and that's the psychological. You can get all the metabolic aspects at 45 degrees Fahrenheit. You don't even have, if you're an international audience, 14 degrees Celsius. I'm trying to do it in my head and I'm not that good with the conversion, but you don't even have to be that cold. But the psychological benefits, they only come when the temperatures frighten you. When you are staring at that ice and you're saying, I could probably skip it today. When it creates what Viktor Frankl called that anticipatory anxiety. That's when you're building your psychological resilience. And we can measure this in your heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is one of the best physiological measures of psychological resilience. And that happens, 39 is not cold enough. I've talked with Scott Carney about this. We compare notes. He's got a Morozko. He's the guy who wrote about Wim Hof, and he's in there all the time. And we're like, what's your cutoff? What really bores you? And he goes, it's about 39. I'm like, well, me too. The difference between 39 and 34 is what scares the crap out of me when I first get in and makes me want to run out. Now, for people who are just starting, they get that at 50. Because they're not cold acclimated, they get in and they start cursing me. They're like, the heck with you, Seager. You can take your Ph.D. and toss it in the lake as far as I'm concerned. I hate this. And then they get out and then they're experiencing that huge dope hit and the norepinephrine is taken over and they feel like Superman. And they're like, I want to move, I want to run a marathon. I want to I should do that again.
Right.
Well, as they become cold acclimated, that effect only happens at lower and lower temperatures.
Gotcha. I have a colleague who she got into cold plunging, I think 1.5 to 2 years ago, but now her staff will ask her, hey, did you do your cold plunge today? You didn't do it, did you? We can tell by your mood. Because her dopamine's low, her norepinephrine's probably low. What does it, cold plunging, it raises norepinephrine the most or dopamine the most?
It's a good question. I haven't really compared because there's this one study out of Poland, and I can't pronounce the guy's name, Smazik or something like that. Huberman cites it. It's gotten a lot of play because he did the blood serum. Like he's measuring the blood. Dopamine up, 250%. And percent isn't even the right way measured anymore. It's like 3 times. Norepinephrine, same order of magnitude, 3-4 times. But there are other neurotransmitters and hormones that are involved. Vasopressin is essential to vasoconstriction. Vasopressin goes up. Oxytocin goes up. It's really fascinating how when you get into the cold, you have this involuntary physiological response that changes your thoughts, that changes your feelings. And you don't even have a choice. You can't be depressed with 3 times the dopamine, coursing through your system. So there's some good case studies on using winter swimming to overcome persistent major depression that was resistant to drugs and talk therapy. These are like miraculous case studies. But I had an experience that I'm writing about in the book. And it was a woman that I was dating. We had scheduled a photo shoot up in Sedona. It's beautiful backdrop, and we're going to get in the forge. And my daughter is the videographer and stuff like that. So she's going to, her daughter. Only problem is we got into this big fight, as people who are dating do, I guess. And so we didn't even go up there together. We drove in separate cars. But she used to be a model and she's a professional. And she's like, I made this commitment. I'm going to show up for the photo shoot. The video is ridiculous because we can't even look at each other. We're so mad at each other. But the script is we're supposed to hold hands. We're supposed to get into the forge together and do this couples plunge like we actually like each other, So
Right.
we're trying it. We get in, we hold hands, we stare, we're breathing. About a minute in, we're smiling and we're laughing. And another minute in, really feeling affectionate towards one another. At like 2.5 minutes, she leans in and she kisses me and we start making out. Now, my daughter's like, okay, it's good. We have enough now. You can cut. And we just fell right back in love. So I had to
That's
look it up.
amazing.
Testosterone is going up. Dopamine is going up. Norepinephrine is going up. All of the neurochemical systems of love and attraction are activated, including vasopressin and oxytocin, which are the bonding cuddle hormones. Like, we didn't even have a choice, Tim. Once we got in there together and we were like looking at one another in the eye, we were gonna like, I don't even remember what we were arguing about anymore. It turns out we had a great weekend.
That's awesome. That's a great story. And there's an intricate link or intimate link between dopamine and testosterone. So sometimes neurotransmitter levels are low, and that leads to low cascade hormones downstream, like testosterone, acetylcholine is associated with growth hormone production. So the neurochemistry is, I mean, I can't prove it, but I think that's probably a main driver of the increase, one of the main drivers.
That makes sense. You're the first person to explain it to me because people have said, well, why? What is happening? And I've always kind of punted, like, I don't understand the mechanisms, although I know testosterone is both physiological and psychological. So there is something about me coming out of the ice bath feeling like I just cheated death, and
Yeah.
then picking up my kettlebells or my steel mace. And I'm like, I'm a Persian warrior. There's something
Yep.
psychological going on. And it's particularly important for men. But the physiology, you're the first one to say, look, it's a hormonal cascade. One hormone is going to stimulate changes in another hormone, and that makes sense.
Yeah. And the other thing I was just thinking through, if it helps to modulate thyroid hormone levels, we know that T2 directly impacts, well, T3 and T2, the mitochondria. And we know that mitochondrial health is several steps upstream of hormonal health. So it might be the combination of the dopamine, mitochondria, boom, improved endocrine levels.
I really like that. I got to look into that more. And you reminded me of something. I'm going to see my urologist. I'm talking to these guys with the prostate. One of the big things that I wanted to avoid was erectile dysfunction, because if you have your prostate removed, there's so much trauma in there that it often takes a long time for the men to recover their sexual performance. And so this is part of what scared the crap out of me. So now I'm writing these articles on testosterone, and some of these men would, they'd write to me and they'd say, well, I got my ice bath and I started practicing, but Is it normal to wake up in the middle of the night with a massive erection? Because this is happening to me and I haven't experienced, and I just want to know, it doesn't mean something's going wrong. And we're so shy about this. And I got to write them back and I say, I think this is healthy.
Yeah.
Are you complaining? And they're like, no, 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 no. I just wanted to know because it's so unusual. So I had to
Yeah.
do some more work. The endothelial cells that line your blood vessel, they are responsible for vasodilation. So vasoconstriction squeezes the blood vessels, cuts off the blood flow. Vasodilation opens it up. So you have this direct pressure connection to the heart. And vasodilation is essential for maintaining an erection because the erection is predicated on blood pressure generated by the heart. All right.
Right.
So how do the endothelial cells work? For a long time, doctors thought that the endothelial cells, which don't actually have a lot of mitochondria in them, don't need the mitochondria to produce nitrous oxide to stimulate the vasodilation. How wrong they were. New study comes out and they say, no, no, this nitric oxide, I'm not even saying it right. Nitrous oxide, it's produced by it's fueled by the ATP produced by the mitochondria in the endothelial cells. If your mitochondria in the endothelial cells aren't right, then you will not get the vasodilation. Erectile dysfunction is one of the first clinical markers of cardiovascular disease. How does Viagra work? Well, it overcomes the insulin resistance to stimulate the mitochondrial function. But it doesn't do it to the benefit of the mitochondria. It does it perhaps even at the expense of the mitochondria. The ice bath stimulates mitobiogenesis, improves mitochondrial function. Instead of coming at their expense, it will improve your vasodilation response. It will improve your sexual performance in men. Women have erectile tissue too. They're just not so much worried about it. The ice bath is better than Viagra. And so I published an article on this. And then you would be amazed, Tim, how the young guys started coming out of the work. They're not worried about their prostate. They want to know why they're 26 years old and they're experiencing like symptoms of ED because we didn't used to see this in young men. Testosterone levels are down. Metabolic disorders are up, mitochondrial dysfunction is up, and they had no idea that this was a metabolic disorder and that they can fix it. Give me 7 days of cold exposure and I don't know how to put it without sounding like I'm in an 8th grade health class or something, but your sexual performance, you're going to notice an immediate improvement. This is something that men need to know.
Absolutely. And with the testosterone, it's interesting that your doctor got his panties in a wad, so to speak, over your levels being at 700 and something. But, the data shows when your levels drop below 550 nanograms per deciliter, a risk of all-cause mortality goes through the roof. And so, we have to stop normalizing pathology because if you're 250, you're quote unquote normal, but you're probably going to be hospitalized with depression, on some major psych meds because the brain is mitochondrially dense, the heart is mitochondrially dense. You improve testosterone, you improve cardiac output, stroke volume, and you improve neurological functioning, mood, motivation, etc. And that goes back into the whole dopamine testosterone link.
So glad you mentioned it. Normal is not healthy.
Right.
Just because you fit into somebody other's diseased bell curve doesn't mean that's what you should be shooting for. I started at 700 before ice baths. And, if any doctor looked at it, they said, oh, you're doing great. But I don't want to be normal. I'll take abnormal and healthy because right now, normal equals sick, at least for guys. I'm 57 now. And a lot of guys my age are already on prescription medications that their doctors are going to tell them they have to take their whole life, whether it's for their cholesterol or it's their blood pressure or all these other things that don't have to be wrong with them because no one is correcting the conditions. They're just trying to treat a symptom. I'm tired of normal.
Yeah, you and me both. And I mean, people ask me, oh, do you take insurance? I just politely tell them insurance doesn't take me. I mean, if you want a 10-minute office visit and, okay, like I so between undergrad and my doctorate program, I was a personal trainer. And I had a client who is a medical doctor. And I was training her one day, and she said that basically, when patients come in, she tells them, you can talk about one problem today. No, if you got another problem, nah, separate visit. I'm like,
For billing,
that makes no
so she
sense,
can code
physiological
it.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so
that's
people,
terrible.
you're right about the stronghold that the pharmaceutical industry and insurance and medical device companies, the FDA, big pharma, and insurance companies are functionally one and the same.
Yep.
People think that they're separate, and oh, the FDA, oh, that's not. Head laugh when I hear, oh, that's not FDA approved. I'm like, okay, good. I'll trust it more. I mean, Vioxx killed over 55,000 people, and it went through stage 4 clinical trials.
Yep.
So, people got to put aside, well, number one, instead of saying there's no research, the better question is, do we need research? Because I've never read a paper that said, we have enough data on this, we need to act on it. We have data from in the 80s or 70s that we haven't implemented yet that could help millions of people. But, most of these studies, the outcomes are predetermined, right? And you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. And so, this as well as I do, but pharmaceutical companies, they can conduct 100 studies. 99 show no benefit, even adverse events from that drug. One study shows moderately sized improvements. They're only going to advertise that one study.
Yep.
And so it's
Alzheimer's
misleading.
is a classic example. There are so many failed attempts to treat Alzheimer's with pharmaceuticals. And there is one successful attempt that I'm aware of to treat Alzheimer's metabolically. But what do you got to do? Well, like 12 things. You got to take magnesium because your mitochondria need magnesium. There's some B vitamins. Vitamin D helps. Cold is magnificent. It's difficult to comply with 12 different things. You got to get your omega-3s right. There's a lot of good things that you can do nutritionally to help the brain. Exercise is a wonderful thing for cognition. They will never have a successful trial of an Alzheimer's drug because there is no drug that can make up for the damage that you're doing to your brain with a metabolic disorder. But when you fix the metabolism, now you give the brain what it needs to fix itself. So I'm kind of angry. My mother died of dementia, and so maybe I feel like I have a personal stake in this. I'm angry because of all the margarine that she thought was healthier for her, of the breakfast cereals that they told her were healthy for her cholesterol. Her last breakfast was cream of wheat made with Ensure, that soybean oil beverage, a cookie for like a reward if she finished her cream of wheat, and apple juice. Tim, it is a recipe for metabolic disorder. And she
Type 3
died a week
diabetes.
after I watched her eat that. Exactly right. So I get a little agitated because it's too late for my mom. And all these Alzheimer's drug trials, in my opinion, are predicated on the fraud. If you can somehow get in there and prevent tau protein phosphorylation or whatever the heck it is that you're going to fix cognition. No, take care of the mitochondria and let the brain take care of itself, and stop lying to my mother, who has now passed on.
Well, I'm very sorry about your mom, but it sounds like you turned your pain into purpose, and hopefully, that continues her legacy moving forward. But yeah, there needs to be more transparency. And it's interesting because you can have a pharmaceutical grade supplement that's, has a third-party independent certificate of analysis. They can't make any claims, even though, we've seen it work on tens of thousands of clients and patients. But you can have a breakfast cereal and say, oh yeah, it lowers my cholesterol. Well, it's probably going to jack up your triglycerides and your insulin resistance.
Exactly right. But it's heart healthy, Honey Nut Cheerios. It's a heart disaster. And yet they get to put it right on the cover, and they get a little sticker from the American Heart Association which gets money from General Mills.
Yeah.
So people have learned not to trust it.
And when I mention these things to people, they're like, "Oh, that's just a bunch of conspiracy stuff." I'm like, "No, like look it up. Just trust me. Like, don't take my word for it. Go look it up."
One of the best things that happened during COVID, I lost a lot of friends, but one of the best things that happened was I found new friends. One of them is Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford. He was one of the first people to develop original blood data saying, COVID isn't community spread. It's been here a lot longer than we thought. These lockdowns are pointless. And so he was very critical of the lockdowns throughout. And he and I commiserated because we had similar points of view and we're in academia. There was a lot of hostility directed towards us. It was heartbreaking to see Jay, who is a physician and a Ph.D., come to the realization at how deep the corruption in our official health policy institutions run. He wanted to believe in the CDC. He wanted to believe in the NIH. And gradually, there were more revelations coming out from the Freedom of Information Act, for example. And when the emails between Fauci and his boss were released, and they specifically called Jay and his friends like Martin Kulldorff fringe epidemiologists and targeted them for censorship, is when Jay came to the conclusion that it was corrupt to the core. The profession that he loved and the institutions that he thought he belonged to, he had no place in. Now, it's far better to see things clearly than to be, it doesn't feel good. But now Jay is on a public health crusade to dismantle the lies that have been institutionalized by these, three-letter agencies. And I'm cheering him on every chance I get.
Absolutely. And what's his last name?
Bhattacharya. Don't ask me to spell it.
Okay.
He said Stanford University, and he's a wonderful person to listen to. You will learn so much from hearing Jay talk about what works in public health policy, what doesn't. And one of the things that doesn't is the censorship.
Yeah. And the guy, Dr. Latipo, Joseph Latipo, who's the Surgeon General for the state of Florida. I went to undergrad with he and his brother at Wake Forest, and he went on to get his MD and PhD from Harvard. And, he called out some of the, logical fallacies. Let's just put it that way. I'm trying to be politically correct here. And people said, "Oh, well, he's not qualified. He doesn't know." And these are the same people who are getting advice from Bill Gates, who can't keep a virus off his laptop. And I mean, he has an MD, PhD from Harvard. I mean, how much more qualified can you get? Oh, but he's not an immunologist. Do you need to be for basic immunology? I'm not an immunologist either, but I understand basic immunology.
So I get this a lot too. They say, well, you're an engineer. You're not a real doctor. Just because you have a PhD doesn't qualify you to give health advice. I say, that's right. I am not qualified to give health advice, and I'm not going to give health advice. Let me just tell you what happened to my testosterone levels after I started ice baths. That's not health advice, just something that happened. Let me tell you to the woman I knew who had an inoperable tumor on her liver that they could not biopsy, they could not remove, they could not treat with chemotherapy. And she's got 4 daughters. She's a single mom. And she asked me, what am I going to do? This tumor came out of nowhere. And now the tumor board at the hospital is telling me watchful waiting is my prescription. I'm just supposed to come back in 6 months and see how fast this thing kills me. I said, no, you're not. You're going to go on a ketogenic diet. You're going to eliminate all refined carbohydrates, all concentrated carbohydrates, no fruit juice. I thought fruit juice was good for me. No, it's not good for you. There's no soda. There's no bread. And you're going to start doing ice baths because we're going to attack this tumor with glucose starvation and ketones. 6 months later, she had her scan, this watchful waiting. She'd gone from 4 centimeters down to 3 centimeters. And there's one thing that spontaneous, inoperable tumors don't do on their own, and that is shrink. When you change the environmental conditions, you give the body what it needs to heal itself. I'm not giving you health advice. I'm just telling you a story about a good friend of mine who made some changes in her diet and in her exposures, and she's pretty happy about them.
Yeah, I think it's a hard pill for people to swallow when they've been in school for that long. I mean, a lot of us have, but a lot of people, they just dig their heels deeper into the sand instead of saying, okay, well, this is what's in front of us. Let's accept it. Let's learn to work with it, modify it if we can, things of that nature. But there are a lot of people like that who just dig their feet further into the sand. And I think I saw on your Instagram that Dr. Courtney Hunt, had like a before and after post with her Hashimoto's of using the Morosco.
Yep. She
Yeah,
is an incredible story of personal transformation because she's both a patient and a medical doctor. And nothing that she learned in medical school prepared her to cure herself of Hashimoto. She had to figure it out by herself. She gave me those like before, after pictures. And I think she's got a reply under there. And she's like, hey, look, Tom, it's not just cold exposure. I got my light hygiene right. I
right.
got myself in and out of ketosis. She's very clever about it. And yet, cold exposure was a critical component of activating her brown fat, re-regulating her thyroid. She says she now knows how to calibrate it. She says, when I feel like a little out of whack, I know how to bring it back. And I think it's because she's incredibly in tune with her body at this point in her life.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing because so many of us are disconnected. We have so many things vying for our attention. And, I read a good quote a few weeks ago. If you don't learn to say no, your body will show you how.
It's a good quote. Yeah.
So you've been a wealth of information. What's one or two or even three things that you know today you wish you would have known 10 to 11 years ago?
Man, vitamin D. Um, it's got, I can't sell you an ice bath by telling you, I wish I knew more about vitamin D, but you are speaking to a personal experience. One of the things that I feel most guilty about, I'm not saying this is rational, but man, if I could have got my son vitamin D he needed when he was a baby, maybe he wouldn't need insulin injections for the rest of his life. I know he's going to be fine. He's got a CGM, continuous glucose monitor. He's got his insulin pump. There's no reason to expect his life expectancy now to be, any shorter than normal. It's all fine. But as a father, feeling like I couldn't care for my son, or as I was defective or something, it creates an emotional wound that makes me want to say to everybody, get your vitamin D right. And I sell ice baths, for goodness sakes.
Right.
So that's one. Let me give you another one, and it's gonna, because we overshadow it. It's the grounding. There is no substitute for grounding. You cannot exercise your way out of grounding. You can't clean up your diet and to fix a grounding problem. The only way to fix this electrical imbalance is grounding. So you've got to get it. And it's built into the Morosco because the fastest, most effective way is water. Water's good conductor, grounding mats, and there are grounding sheets, and those things are fine. I don't want to dissuade anybody, but the best grounding is the ocean. The second best is like fresh water. The third best is your Morosco. So if once you got the message on vitamin D, I don't want people to forget that we are like bioelectric creatures. And when that gets out of whack, it's no wonder our emotions suffer. It's no wonder our immune system suffers. It's no wonder we become inflamed. And we can fix a lot of it by grounding on a regular basis. So even though I'm a cold guy, I'm going to give you those two.
Yeah, I actually sleep on, I don't know if you've heard of it, the Magnetico 10 Gauss pad goes underneath your
I don't know that
mattress.
one.
Yeah,
I've,
so
I've got
Jack
my
Cruz,
own. Yeah.
yeah, Jack Cruz taught me about it, and you can get, at least this is the way it was when I bought it, a 10 Gauss or 20 Gauss, and they're very heavy, but it's supposed to recreate, something close to the Schumann resonance. And I did notice, waking up feeling a little more well rested. My mood has been a little better. I've been using it since 2014. And so, I try to get outside and ground. I need to be more consistent with it. But yeah, why, since you brought that up, how much of an expense was it to go to the effort of grounding the Morosco versus just saying, no, we're just going to do the cold plunge?
Zero expense. And I'll tell you why. We wanted ice. Like we got used to ice baths and buying the ice. And so when we were inventing an ice bath and there was nothing in the world that actually made ice, we're like, it's going to make ice. Dang it. A lot of people have said, well, do you need the ice? And I say, you don't. You know, you can do a cold plunge. You can get all the benefits. You can get down to 34 degrees without ice. But I need the ice because that would, there's a certain sound it makes. I feel it on my body, but mostly when I'm looking down at the water and I see ice floating, I know it's going to be cold. So we wanted ice. Now, to do that, we have to get the condensing coils for the the evaporative coils for the refrigeration. We have to get it right up a tub. And we chose a metal tub because that's the way we started. The metal conducts electricity. The tub will, of course, electrically be connected to the water. It is also electrically connected to these copper evaporative coils that we built. The copper evaporative coils go to the compressor. The compressor has a grounding wire in it that goes right into the grounding outlet of your home. There's a ground fault circuit interrupt that is built into the Morozco so that any faults in ground and it shuts the power off right away. That's an important safety feature. But as a result of this chain of metal going to the water itself is grounded. Now, if you have an acrylic tub, or you have a fiberglass tub, or if you have a Rubbermaid container, or if you have like a chest freezer from Kenmore or something like that, none of these things are the case because it's cheaper and quicker to get a chiller. You know, you can buy one from China and there's a pump and it sucks water in and it runs it through the chiller and it returns cold water, you know, to your acrylic bathtub or whatever. It's really easy to make. That's not what we did because I guess we're too stupid to do it the easy way. But you can't make ice because ice won't pump. You have to bring the cold to the tub. And as soon as we brought the cold to the tub, we brought the electrical grounding to the tub. And so I talk about this because it's a competitive advantage to Morozco. And I can do my table and I say, hey, you know, is that one grounded? And sometimes that's important to customers. But I'm also doing it because grounding's important. You don't have to have a Morozco to get grounded. But gosh darn, when I get in there, I want to know from a safety standpoint and from a health standpoint, I want to know I'm electrically connected straight to the earth. So I really designed it with Jason for me. And it kind of, we didn't know there was going to be a market. And the next thing you know, Ben Greenfield puts us in his book. And like it blows up. Joe Rogan gets one and he can't stop talking about us. And I got to figure out how to be a businessman. But Tim, I really suck. Like, I don't know advertising. I don't know search engine optimization. I don't know this digital sales funnel stuff. I'm an engineer and a professor. And so these other companies come along and they're cheaper and they're much more clever. They're all in my Instagram feed, you know, and they've grown faster than we have because they're better businessmen than we are. Me, I know how to ground a tub. I know how electrons work. And so I'm staying in my sweet spot. I'm trying to learn the rest of the stuff. In the meantime, we focus on the engineering.
Yeah, it's a lot to learn the science and the business part. And sometimes, well, I think a lot of the companies, there's more marketing than science. And so, you know, that's unfortunate, but it's like with
Here's
anything else.
something I've
CBD,
learned. Anybody who says they have a revolutionary new ultimate product is full of crap. Like, if you hear those adjectives, there is nothing revolutionary and it is not the ultimate. The only reason those adjectives are there is because they bought the same thing everybody else does from China and they're trying to puff up the marketing. And I've found that out the hard way.
absolutely. Well, Dr. Tom, you've been a wealth of knowledge. If people want to purchase a Morozco, we're going to put the link up. Is there anything in the works? And I know you have your book coming out. You want to plug that?
I got a working title for it. It's called Uncommon Cold, the science and experience of cold water immersion therapy something along those lines. I would love to say, hey, click this link, buy my book. But Tim, I'm at 100,000 words and I got probably 30,000 words, left to go. There's something like 360 scientific citations in this book, and I can't stop myself. The agents and the authors, they're all saying, Dr. Seager, you got to cut this in half. There's no market for this. Like, you have to be Kindle optimized with the audiobook, and it has to be a 6-hour. There's all these rules about publishing that I'm learning. And I don't really care. Because I'm a professor, I want to create the definitive scientific work on the benefits and risks and practices of cold exposure. And so it's going to take me 4 freaking more months to finish this thing. And then I'm going to send it to everybody who's bought a Morozco for free and say, this is going to help you get the most out of your equipment. Maybe I'll sell a bunch of books. Talk with Ben Bickman. He wrote Why We Get Sick, and he's done very well. And it's an excellent book. And so maybe I'll feel like a real author someday. But in the meantime, there's just things I got to figure out. If I'm going to go on this podcast and I don't have it all stored in my brain, then I feel like an idiot. Writing it down in this book has been a way of organizing it in my head so I can talk about it intelligently. And now I want people to be able to read it. They don't have to read all 100,000 words. If they're just working on Alzheimer's, I have a chapter for you. Working on an autoimmune disorder, I have a chapter for you. If you're working on testosterone, just read the one chapter. You're going to get what you need out of it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Keep spreading the knowledge, and we appreciate you so much, and hopefully we can have you back on in the future for an update.
I'd love that. Thank you for having me for this.
Awesome. Have a blessed rest of your day.
You too, Tim. Take care.